Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 8 as part of my American Civil War series. So this is, of course, History and Politics with Dr. Tom. And please make sure that if you like this video or any other videos in this and on this channel, that you please subscribe and click on like as often as you wish. Now, today's lecture is focusing on the creation of the Confederate States of America and also Lincoln's inauguration. Now, these are two very, very significant events in the very last stage of the build-up to the American Civil War, and I find these to be very interesting pieces of American political history, and I hope that you will very much agree with me on that. Now, if you look at the house in the photograph here on the screen, that is the first Confederate White House. That is the Confederate capital of Montgomery, Alabama, and that will be the Confederate capital for the early stages of the American Civil War. And you'll see flying in front of that house is actually the Stars and Bars, the Confederate national flag, noting that that building was the Confederate White House for a short period. Now, with this newly formed Confederate States of America, they also will need a Capitol building. So they are going to use the Alabama State Capitol building, also in Montgomery, for that purpose. And please note the statue standing in front of the columns of the Alabama State House. That is Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. And the reason that that statue is there is to mark where he gave his first inaugural speech as the President of the Confederate States of America. He will be the only President of the Confederate States of America. Now, you can just barely see Jefferson Davis between the two middle columns of in the black and white photograph that we have there on the left, and just barely see him there. But we are very lucky that we did have a photographer present at time that his inaugural address was given. So let's take a look at the lineup of this newly created Confederate government, Confederate cabinet specifically. So Jefferson Davis of Mississippi will serve as president. Vice president will be actually a rather arch nemesis of his, Alexander Stephens of Georgia, and one of his good friends, Robert Toombs, will serve as Secretary of State. By his friend, Alex Stephens' friends, not Jefferson Davis' friend. Secretary of Treasury, Christopher Memminger of South Carolina. LeRoy Pope Walker of Alabama will be Secretary of War. Secretary of Navy will be Stephen Mallory of Florida. Postmaster General will go to John H. Reagan of Texas, and Judah P. Benjamin of Louisiana will serve as the Attorney General. So if you look at that starting lineup, you will see that all 7 Confederate states are represented. Now let's take a look at Jeff Davis's inaugural speech. So he says, sustained by the consciousness that the transition from the former Union to the present Confederacy has not proceeded from a disregard on our part of just obligations or any failure to perform every constitutional duty, moved by no interest or passion to invade the rights of others, anxious to cultivate peace and commerce with all nations, if we may not hope to avoid war, we may at least expect that posterity will acquit us of having needlessly engaged in it. Doubly justified by the absence of wrong on our part, and by wanton aggression on the part of others, there can be no cause to doubt that the courage and patriotism of the people of the Confederate States will be found equal to any measures of defense which honor and security may require. If a just perception of mutual interest shall permit us peaceably to pursue our separate political career, my most earnest desire will have been fulfilled. But if this be denied us, and the integrity of our territory and jurisdiction be assailed, it will but remain for us, with firm resolve, to appeal to arms and invoke the blessings of Providence on a just cause. Should reason guide the action of the government from which we have separated, a policy so detrimental to the civilized world, the northern states included, cannot be dictated even the strongest desire to inflict injury upon us. But otherwise, a terrible responsibility will rest upon it, and the suffering of millions will bear testimony to the folly and wickedness of our aggressors. So let's take apart these three major parts of Jefferson Davis's inaugural speech. So what he's saying here is that he seeks peaceful separation from the North, peaceful separation from the United States, and the creation of the newly created Confederate States. But if necessary, then the Confederacy will fight for its newly declared independence from the United States. And saying also that if such a war will break out, it will be the cause of the North, not of the South, but the South has the right, and basically saying also that the backing of God in defending themselves. So that's very interesting. And that, of course, keynote speech is one of two major parts of the Confederate inaugural speech in 1861. The other one is the raising of the Confederate national flag over the Alabama State Capitol building, officially making that building the Confederate Capitol building. So that was actually done by the daughter of former President John Tyler of Virginia. Now, John Tyler was still alive at this point, and he had declared his allegiance to the Confederate States of America. He will die midway through 1862, and he will have a Confederate flag over his coffin at his funeral. So that's an interesting aspect of American Civil War history that we don't often talk about. Now, if you go to Montgomery, Alabama today and you go to the State House, you will see underneath the columns there is a bronze star which is affixed to one of the tiles on the ground there, and that marks where Jefferson Davis stood when he gave his inaugural speech in 1861. Ironically, that is also the exact spot where Martin Luther King Jr. will stand in 1865 when he gave a very powerful speech marking the successful completion of the Selma to Montgomery March, which will play a huge role in the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Now, before I get going on the actual members of the Confederate cabinet, we'll start with the president, of course, I want to highlight the fact that you will see that there is not a single fire eater in the Confederate cabinet. And that is very interesting, a real twist actually, and as far as the South's approach to the issues of the day, because obviously Calhoun is dead by this point, but they're not going to have any other fire eaters, who are still alive in 1861 serving in the Confederate cabinet. So, people like Roger Pryor, people like Edmund Ruffin, William Lowndes Yancey, none of these guys will be serving in the Confederate cabinet. Quite the contrary. These guys are, by comparison to the fire eaters, are very moderate. And you'll see that some of them were very critical of the fire eaters during the period of ultra-sectionalism in the 1850s. So let's start with doing a bit of a background check on Jefferson Davis, who is now the president of the Confederate States of America. So born in Kentucky, Fairview, Kentucky, that is a slave state which has not yet seceded. Now, yet, I'm going to say that because I don't want to spoil any surprise of what decision they may or may not take when we get later in 1861. So we'll say nothing more there. But it is a slave state. It is toying with the idea of secession at this point, but so far has not yet made its mind up. But Davis is not, a full-fledged Kentuckian, really, because he moved to Mississippi at a very, very early age and had little to no memory of living in Kentucky. Now, more importantly, his background as a politician and, interestingly, also as a military man. This is important. He was a graduate of West Point, the United States Military Academy, and he does serve in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846, but he resigned because he wanted to fight in the Mexican War as an officer. So he does serve in that capacity, survives the war, And so from 1847 to 1851, he will serve as a senator for the state of Mississippi in the United States Senate. And he will do that again from 1857 to 1861, serving as a chairman of Military Affairs Committee. So that is very important. Of course, the U.S. Congress has numerous congressional committees. So Davis was the chairman of the Military Affairs Committee. And that's very relevant considering, he is going to be serving as a president, or he likes to call himself such, when this American Civil War does actually break out. So he does have some experience with political leadership in regards to the military. And that's very important. He also serves as the U.S. Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce from 1853 to 57. So that gives him also some very good cabinet level experience with military affairs. And it was while in that capacity that he favored the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that shouldn't be of any huge surprise, because during his first term as a senator for Mississippi, he did very much go against the Compromise of 1850. He thought it favored the North too much. He did feel that states had the right to leave the Union, that was a right that was constitutionally protected because the Constitution didn't mention it. Therefore, that should be left to the states to decide as a result of the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. However, I need to point out the fact that Jefferson Davis personally did not favor secession. And even after Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, he tried to calm down the more hot-headed members of Southern society and said, look, we gotta really be cautious here and not do something like some crazy knee-jerk reaction, which is going to create a lot of trouble for us. And when the day came in January of 1861 that Mississippi seceded, Jefferson Davis very sadly referred to it as, quote, the saddest day of my life. But nonetheless, he will support his home state of Mississippi, and he will serve in the most senior capacity of the Confederate government, serving as a president. Now, I need to point out the fact that Jefferson Davis favored a confederacy with a strong central government. He recognized the need for strong state sovereignty. However, he did very much think that the Confederate states should be under the jurisdiction of a strong federal government, basically. Not terribly unlike what they had been experiencing from Washington. Now, Alexander Stephens, who will serve as the vice president of the Confederacy, is very different from Jefferson Davis. First of all, as we mentioned, Davis favored a strong central government within the Confederacy. Alexander Stephens did not, in spite of the fact that he would be the second highest member of that central government. Stephens favored strong state sovereignty, individual state sovereignty, that the individual 7 Confederate states would have the opportunity to veto any order directed at them by the central government of the Confederate States of America. So he and Davis were not singing from the same hymn sheet at all from the very beginning. But these two gentlemen are very different, not just politically, but also in regards to their backgrounds. Jeff Davis found wealth very early into his life. Stephens, on the other hand, grew up in poverty. And in fact, he lost both of his parents by the time he was an early teenager. And after that, he then had to move in with his uncle in Crawfordville, Georgia. So Stephens benefited from his uncle having a study that had a large collection of books. And Stephens became a very avid reader. Reading became his main hobby. And well, if you read enough, you become intelligent. And therefore, because of that, he ended up being able to study law at Franklin College. Franklin College is part of the present-day University of Georgia. He did very well there, started a good career as a lawyer, became wealthy as a result, ended up purchasing a few dozen slaves on the way, and he does become a member of the United States House of Representatives, representing his district in Georgia from 1843 to 59, which is the only federal position Stevens will ever hold in his career. He will also serve as a Whig rather than a Democrat for most of that time. He doesn't join the Democrats till 1854, so he spends most of his career as a member of the Whig Party. Stevens had a reputation of being anti-Southern by a lot of staunch Southerners. And I want to point out the fact that Stevens opposed the Mexican War, in spite of the fact that should the United States go to war with Mexico, they could, if they win, acquire a lot of land from that country. And that land would, well, for the most part, would be south of the old Missouri Compromise line. Therefore, that new territory could be cut up and enter the Union as new slave states. So in spite of that gain that the South could potentially gain from the Mexican War, Stevens did not support that conflict at all. Interestingly, when the Wilmot Proviso comes about later that decade, he does come out against that. So very much showing some pro-slavery sentiment there. But when we get to 1850, with the compromise being put before Congress, Stevens voted against it. And that's in spite of the fact that the compromise of 1850 very much gave senatorial control and power to the free states of the North, forever tipping the balance in favor of the North by allowing basically two new pro-free state senators to enter the Senate. But he supported it anyway. And when the Compromise of 1850 was finalized, Stevens did publicly refer to himself as a Unionist, which angered a lot of people in the South who thought that he was a bit of a scalawag. Now, when you get to 1854, he does support the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is obviously very pro-Southern. But I need to point out the fact that he was very critical of fire raiders, vehemently critical of the fire raiders, and made no secret of that. And he was anti-secession throughout the 1850s, again, was something that most fire raiders very much wanted. But where things really got dangerous for Stevens was in 1859, when he gave a speech stating that the Oregon Territory should enter the American Union as a free state. Now that made a lot of Southerners angry. And so with that in mind, the next trip that he took down to Atlanta, Georgia, he ended up being attacked in a hotel by a justice on the Georgia State Supreme Court. And that was Francis Cone. Cone stabbed him 6 times. And if you look at that photograph of Stevens on the right-hand side there, if you look underneath his left eye, you will see a scar. That's from that attack by Cone. He also became permanently disabled as a result of that attack. One of his hands never worked again. The attack almost killed him, so he's lucky to be alive at this point. Now, when we get to the 1860 election, the following year, Stevens does not support John C. Breckinridge and the Southern Democrats. Instead, he campaigns for Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democratic candidate. So that was something that also angered a lot of Southerners. And, well, then Lincoln wins the election. And not long after, the state of Georgia starts toying with the idea of getting out of the Union. And when they do finally decide to have a secession convention, they invited Stevens to be a member of that convention. And during the vote, Stevens voted against secession. So again, what you're seeing here is some of the more senior Confederate politicians are very much moderate compared to a lot of the Southern senators and representatives who we've been looking at up to this point. Now, Stevens is pro-slavery. We need to make that very clear right now. And that could not be more obvious than by looking at his cornerstone speech. And let's look at what he said in that speech, that the new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery as it exists amongst us. The proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. What was conjecture with him is now a realized fact. But whether he fully comprehended the great truth upon which that rock stood and stands may be doubted. The prevailing ideas entertained by him and most of the leading statesmen at the time, the formation of the old Constitution, were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with. But the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution would be evanescent and pass away. This idea, though not incorporated in the Constitution, was the prevailing idea at the time. The Constitution, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last, and hence no argument can be justly urged against the constitutional guarantees thus secured, because of the common sentiment of the day. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Now, so he's very critical of the abolitionists and their sentiment towards the institution of slavery. And he states that this new government is going to change the approach to slavery. It's going to protect it. So let's take a look at what he says about that. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordinate to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. This truth has been slow in the process of its development, like all other truths, in the various departments of science. Those at the North who still cling to these errors with a zeal above knowledge, we justly denominate fanatics. All fanaticism springs from an aberration of the mind, from a defect in reasoning. It is a species of insanity. One of the most striking characteristics of insanity, in many instances, is forming correct conclusions from fancied or erroneous premises. So with the anti-slavery fanatics, their conclusions are right if their premises were. They assume that the Negro is equal, and hence conclude that he is entitled to equal privileges and rights with the white man. If their premises were correct, their conclusions would be logical and just, but their premise being wrong, their whole argument fails. They were attempting to make things equal, which the Creator had made unequal. So there can be no mistake about this. The Confederate States of America was created for the purpose of preserving the institution of slavery, and you simply cannot get away from that. Now, one of Stephen's good friends, Robert Toombs, we mentioned that he's going to serve as the first Secretary of State of the Confederacy. Now, born near Crawfordville in Washington, Georgia, like Stevens, he attended Franklin College at the University of Georgia, but he ended up being kicked out for a few things. Cheating on a card game once was deemed poor conduct of a student of the university. And also, there's one day where he apparently chased a couple of students around the campus with a hatchet. And after that, decided, okay, let's get this guy out of here. He's crazy. So they threw him out. And that was right before he was scheduled to graduate. So the same year, he graduated from Union College, interestingly, in New York, a long way away from Georgia. He also earned a law degree at the University of Virginia. And now, I need to point out, Toombs had a rough life. Depression was a real problem of his for his whole life. By that, I mean clinical depression. As a result, he became an avid alcoholic. He served in the Georgia House of Representatives, so state level, but only periodically, from 1838 to 1844, since he didn't really enjoy that job too much. But he seemed to really enjoy federal politics, because when he is going to be elected to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Georgia, in 1854, he will serve in that position, well, through the whole time, all the way to 1853, when he is finally elected to serve in the United States Senate. Now, he was a Whig when he was a member of the House of Representatives, a Democrat when he joins the United States Senate. Now, like Stevens, he was against the Mexican War. Like Stevens, he supported the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Like Stevens, he was a sharp critic of the Fire Eaters. Now, he did openly blame the Republican Party for John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So that shows that he does, participate in some of the Southern propaganda at the time. Unlike Stevens, he will campaign for John C. Breckinridge in the 1860 election, supporting the Southern Democratic Party. But after Lincoln won, Toombs told his fellow Georgians they needed to give Lincoln a chance to be a president who followed the Constitution. Now, follow the Constitution, in Toombs' mind, that means honoring the 10th Amendment, the last of the 10 Bill of Rights, giving states the authority to control their own destiny in regards to anything the Constitution doesn't refer to, and for him that meant the institution of slavery. Now, when Georgia does start, getting very serious about secession, Toombs does suddenly change his mind, and he will support Georgia's secession from the United States. Immediately after, he starts making very clear to a lot of people that he would like to be the president of the nation to be formed, the Confederacy. And like Stevens, he was a state sovereignty candidate. He favored not having a strong central government looking over all the states, and basically the same way the federal government had it in Washington. So he wanted strict sovereignty of the individual states to be honored by any central government created for the Confederacy. Now, because of his being a well-known alcoholic, they decided he was not suitable for the presidency, but saw that he was a very talented man anyway, so he will get a cabinet role, of course, as Secretary of State. But need to make a point here, he had absolutely no experiences with foreign affairs at all, so probably not really fit for the job. Christopher Memminger. Now, mentioned that he's from South Carolina, but he's originally born in Württemberg, Germany. But he moved to Charleston at a very, very early age. Like Robert Toombs and like Stevens, had a very sad life, orphaned at an early age. And now he goes against South Carolina and a number of the state's issues, particularly, first of all, the nullification crisis in the 1830s. He went against his home state on that one, and he did not favor nullification, certainly did not favor secession. In fact, he was anti-secession all the way until the first ever Republican candidate was elected. After that, he thought, okay, this is new ground, let's get out. And so he does support South Carolina secession. He does support the creation of the Confederate States of America, and he will serve on the Constitutional Committee for the Confederacy, and basically creating a facsimile of the United States Constitution. Stephen Mallory. Mentioned he's a Floridian, but he was actually born in the British West Indies. Moved to Florida as a child. He will serve in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, not Florida Senate, 1851 to 61. He will serve as a chairman of the Senate Committee on Naval Affairs, and that was why Jefferson Davis saw Mallory fit for the role of Secretary of Navy for the newly created Confederate government. Now, like the other candidates we've been looking at, Mallory was anti-secession, but when Florida secedes, he will support his home state. Now, when we get to April of 1861, we're going to have a bit of a problem with a fort in the middle of Charleston Harbor, which will not be abandoned by U.S. forces after the secession of that state and followed by the creation of the Confederate States of America. And there's another fort in Pensacola, Florida, that is in the same boat. Mallory made very clear early on that he was against the idea of taking those forts by force. That would not end well. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But you can see here, you got some very moderate people serving on this cabinet. compare with, again, the fire eaters who we've covered so far. John H. Reagan, born in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, but he does move to Texas in his late teens, and he does consider Texas his primary home. He's a lawyer by trade, but he is going to start serving in state-level politics in 1847 for the Texas State House of Representatives. He will serve as a U.S. District Court judge, 1852 to 57. He will serve in the U.S. House of Representatives at the end of that, from 1857 to 61, and he will be in that position until his home state of Texas does secede from the Union. And he was one member of the Texas Secession Convention who did vote in favor of Texas seceding, but up to that point, he was anti-secession. So another anti-secessioner on the Confederate cabinet. He was, however, very much pro-slavery. Judah P. Benjamin, very interesting character in American history. He is the first ever Jewish cabinet member in American history. Born in the Danish West Indies, but moved to Charleston, South Carolina as a child, but then could not resist the temptation of the brighter lights of New Orleans, Louisiana. He will attend Yale University up in New England in Connecticut. So obviously very, very intelligent. He's going Ivy League. He will serve as a senator for the state of Louisiana from 1853 to 61. So he will obviously leave when his home state of Louisiana leaves the Union. While a senator, he did support the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Not a big surprise. He was not in favor of secession until basically the end of the decade, when he said that it should only be the last option if all negotiations fail. So again, largely anti-secession. But it's interesting, Benjamin will serve in 3 Confederate cabinet positions in this war. Attorney General first, then Secretary of War, then Secretary of State. So a very, very important member of the Confederate cabinet. Now, this brings us to a big question. What was the Confederacy? Was it a nation? Was it a league of rebel states? That's something that's been debated throughout time. You have some people, such as James I. Robertson Jr., who was one of the leading Civil War historians, who said that the Confederates absolutely were not rebels, that they were more loyal to their home states, and they did not in any way disassemble law and order or government where they were, i.e. their respective state governments, and therefore you cannot call them rebels. But then you have some other ones, such as James McPherson. He has said that the Confederates very much were rebels, that because they're leaving the American Union, they're rebelling, they are breaking away from the United States, that makes them rebels. So you do have opposing arguments on this. But let's take a look at some of the images in front of us. So we'll start on the right-hand side. Stacked on top of each other, you have got 3 Confederate dollar bills, a 20, and you got 2 100s. Now note that there was more than one pattern for a number of the Confederate banknotes. So look at that $20 bill there. You got in the bottom right-hand corner, the Vice President Alex Stevens. Look at that $100 bill. You have in the bottom left, John C. Calhoun. And also look in the middle of that middle $100 bill, and you will see slaves working a field that is engraved on that $100 bill. It was ultimately the machinery of the Confederate nation. And then, of course, on the bottom one, you will have a future Secretary of War in the bottom right. So not to go into who he is yet, because, well, the time hadn't quite come yet. In the middle, you'll see a Confederate postal stamp. And Confederate postal stamps do all feature Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, on them. And now, Confederate stamps were not printed in the Confederacy. They were printed by DeLaRue and Company, owned by Warren DeLaRue and also helped by his brother William Frederick DeLaRue. Both of them very pro-Confederate Britons. And so the DeLaRue brothers do allow the Confederacy to use their headquarters in London, England, to print all of their stamps. And so the Confederate stamps were printed by the same company which printed a lot of stamps for the British Empire. DeLaRue and Company also provided the plates that will be used to print the Confederate money. And of course, you can see on the left, on the top, you've got some Confederate coins. And then on the bottom left, bank bond, you could invest in the Confederacy. And a lot of people did that, including a lot of British people. The Confederacy has a president, it has a cabinet, it's got a bicameral legislature, it's got a Supreme Court, it's got a constitution, it has a postal service, it has an army, it has a navy. Rubbish is collected every Tuesday. It looks like a nation. It functions as a nation. It's got its own flag. It's got its own seal. It's got all these things. And so it must be a nation, right? Well, that's also debated. It functions like one. There's a problem here if you look beneath the surface. And what I'd like to do is focus let's look at those Confederate banknotes again. There's a bit of a problem there. It's a good idea to back your currency with gold that gives it value. Well, the Confederates didn't have enough gold to back their currency. So what do they back it with? Bales of cotton, which would easily have set on fire. So the Confederate currency wasn't worth very much. And so in a lot of ways, it lacked the seriousness, the legitimacy that a nation should have. And at the same time, what does make you an independent country is the fact that foreign countries have to recognize your independence, and enough of them. And at the same time, if you're having to fight for your independence and the country you're having to fight against to attain that independence hasn't yet recognized your independence, that also makes it hard for you to be recognized as an independent nation. So yes, it looks like a country. It focuses as a country, and it functions as a country in a lot of ways, but it in a lot of ways is not a country. So I would say it would have to win this war in order to become an official country. Now, with the secession crisis, with the creation of the Confederate States of America, we have a real problem within the federal government, and Lincoln has got so much work he's going to have to do when he does come to power in March of 1861. And things aren't made any better by the current president, a Democrat, James Buchanan. Now, let's look at some of these quotes here by Buchanan. Remember, he's a Northern Democrat. It says, "No state has a right by its own act to secede from the Union or throw off its federal obligations at pleasure." Okay, fair enough. That's in line with what a lot of Northerners think, if not all of them. But Buchanan made things very difficult when he said that there was nothing that the federal government could do to force these 7 states back into the Union. He said, no such power has been delegated to Congress or to any other government department or federal government. So again, you can see that Buchanan seems to be talking out both sides of his mouth between December of 1860 and March of 1861. And he even seemed to defend the South when he said, all it is necessary to accomplish the object being reunification of the Union, and all for which the slave states have ever contended, is to be let alone and permitted to manage their domestic institutions in their own way. What's he saying there? You can get the South back in by guaranteeing protection of slavery. So he's taking their side. So with that, now we get to March of 1861, and we've got a new sheriff in town. Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated the president as president of the United States, 4th of March, 1861. And he is going to have a vice president, Hannibal Hamlin. Now, back then, the vice president was not officially listed as a member of his cabinet, which is why I don't have Mr. Hamlin here on this list. So I have members of his cabinet here. William H. Seward of New York will serve as Secretary of State. Controversial decision. Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase of Ohio. Secretary of War, Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania. Another controversial decision. Attorney General will go to Edward Bates of Missouri, a slave state. Gideon Welles, a Democrat from Connecticut. So a Democrat, but from a New England state. Montgomery Blair, a Democrat, again, from a slave state, Maryland. He will serve as Postmaster General. And the Secretary of the Interior, Caleb B. Smith of Indiana. So if you look at that photograph on the right, you will see Abraham Lincoln giving his inaugural speech. And you will also notice, looking at the Capitol building in the background, that the American flag is actually propped up on the steps, not in its current place, above the portico there. That is because actually the scaffolding and the crane work meant it was impossible to put the flag at that position at that point. So the Capitol building at this point is under construction. The dome, the bottom tier of it is up, is almost finished, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Now, with the possibility of a war breaking out, one question Lincoln's going to get the next month is, should we continue constructing the Capitol building? Because it takes a lot of manpower to build a structure that big. And, well, wartime, you need manpower. You stop unnecessary projects. It's not necessary to have the dome finished because you got the wings of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and so we don't need this dome to be finished. We can send these men off to war. But Lincoln made the decision to keep on building the dome because he thought that for purposes of morale, it was very good to show that construction of the dome still going on. Now, let's look at Lincoln's inaugural speech. And Lincoln, of course, is trying to urge quite a lot of calm here. At this point, you've had secession of 7 states. They've come together now to form the Confederate States of America. They've created their own government. They've got a president, a cabinet. So Lincoln is going to really have to, play his cards right if he wants them to rejoin the Union. And you can see that that's what he's really trying to do in his inaugural speech. And that first quote there, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping to another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." Now that is interesting. That is Lincoln endorsing and saying that he fully intends to uphold the Fugitive Slave Act. And Lincoln, as a lawyer, made quite a lot of money filling out the paperwork to return fugitive slaves to their owners in the South. So let's carry on. "It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had provision in its organic law for its own termination, continue to execute all the express provisions of our national constitution, and the Union will endure forever, it being impossible to destroy it, except by some action not provided for in the instrument itself. Plainly, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy." Ha! So Lincoln is essentially endorsing slavery where it exists, saying he will protect it, and he will protect the Fugitive Slave Act, but that he will draw the line. He does not support secession. And he's essentially saying he will act against it. And he addresses the Southerners and the Northerners on the issues of slavery. He says, "One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is only substantial dispute. fugitive slave clause of the Constitution and the law for the suppression of the foreign slave trade are each as well enforced, perhaps as any law can ever be in a community where the moral sense of the people imperfectly support the law itself. So here he is saying that North and South disagree vehemently over the issue of slavery, but he is saying that we uphold the fugitive slave law. We uphold the outlawing of the transatlantic slave trade, which has been illegal in the United States since 1808. He says to the Southerners here, "In your own hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." He is very much the chief executive officer of the United States. It is his job to uphold the Constitution. It is his job to maintain the well-being of the United States. And so he is saying that there is potentially going to be a civil war on the horizon. However, what he says in that paragraph is very interesting. Basically, it sounds like there will not be a war unless you, the Southerners, start it. Very interesting. Let's keep that one in mind. All right, and the last one. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Lincoln was an incredibly eloquent speaker, speechwriter, all the above. Very intelligent man, had a way with words, if you will. And he is extending an olive branch to the South here. He's making it very clear he does not want war. If there's going to be a war, it's because the South starts it, not him. And that is what is most significant from this inaugural speech, in addition to the fact that he says that he will not do anything to injure slavery where it currently exists. Now let's take a look at who's working with President Lincoln. Hannibal Hamlin, who is a New Englander, so not like Lincoln, who's from the old Northwest of the state of Illinois. Now Hamlin is from the town of Paris, not France, Massachusetts, as it was when he was born. Remember that Maine was created as part of the Missouri Compromise in 1820. So from that point on, his hometown was in Maine, Maine being carved out of Massachusetts. He interestingly was a Democrat all the way until well into the 1850s. Very interesting, especially considering he was a pretty hardcore abolitionist, which is not unusual for someone from New England, but is unusual for a Democrat. A lot of Democrats were not keen on the institution of slavery. They would not like to be categorized as abolitionists. Hamlin was not terribly on good terms with Lincoln. He thought Lincoln was too soft on slavery. He didn't like the fact that Lincoln did not consider himself to be an abolitionist. And so that's where those two very much did not get on from the very beginning. And that's important to point out. Lincoln was not an abolitionist at this point. Hamlin most certainly was. Now, Hamlin will serve as a state-level politician from 1843 to 47, serving in his home state of Maine's House of Representatives. He will also be the governor of Maine very briefly, January to February 1857, so really 1 month, because he got elected as senator for his state. The rural senator is more senior than being a governor of the state, so he took it, and he will be a Republican senator for the state of Maine all the way until he is sworn in as the Vice President of the United States on the 4th of March of 1861. William H. Seward. Now, this is a very controversial appointment here. So Seward is going to, of course, be the Secretary of State, so dealing with foreign affairs. Now that is very controversial. Let's look at this guy's background. Born in Orange County, New York, has a big estate of Auburn there, wealthy man. A graduate of Union College like Robert Toombs, the Secretary of State of the Confederacy. And he will serve as the governor of New York from 1839 to 42. Then he takes a break from politics and he serves as a senator from New York from 1849 to 1861. Interestingly, he will serve as a Whig all the way till the mid-1850s, at which point he will leave the Whig Party and become a member of the Republican Party. Now, what I need to do is let's take a look at Seward as governor. Now, New York, as a lot of New Yorkers will tell you, had a lot of immigrants arriving from Ireland throughout the 19th century. And Seward knew that he would benefit from getting the Irish, almost as a bloc, voting for him in the gubernatorial race. So in his speeches, he expressed a lot of anti-English, anti-British views. Well, those were reported in the London newspapers. He did the same thing when he was running for the Senate, the state of New York. A lot of anti-British sentiment in those speeches. It got worse when, in 1859, the British had their first official state visit to the United States. Now, this is in the reign of Queen Victoria, obviously. Victoria herself did not come. She sent her son, who is the Prince of Wales, and that is young Prince Edward. Future King Edward VII, who will become King of England in 1901 when Victoria finally dies. And he brought with him the Duke of Newcastle and some other personnel. Now, the Prince of Wales, at the state banquet at the White House, all senators were invited to attend for at least part of it. Seward showed up and appeared to be a bit inebriated, and he made his way over to the Prince of Wales and started harassing him. So he's well known in British circles as being anti-British. Yet Lincoln has now made him the Secretary of State. He's going to be dealing with foreign affairs. Now this was, you could say, a poor decision if you want to keep Britain out of this war, because what this does immediately is put a lot of British people on the side of the Confederacy, because with Seward having such a senior cabinet role, and Lincoln is virtually unknown to them, aside from the fact that they knew that Lincoln had never left the United States before, that his administration is anti-British, therefore potentially a threat to Canada. And Seward did suggest to Lincoln at one point that perhaps the United States should one day invade Canada and take land from there. So Seward is known for being anti-British, and the British government was very concerned about Lincoln's administration because of the appointment of Seward as Secretary of State. Now, back to 1861, when they first come into power. Seward actually proposed a constitutional amendment that would give slavery full federal protection. And the idea is to stop secession in its tracks. Lincoln, not only did he support this was Lincoln's idea. Lincoln, remember, is not an abolitionist. Seward is more anti-slavery than Lincoln is, but he goes along with this. And Seward did actually also try very much to reach out to some of his friends who were Southern senators to get on board with this. And he was on very good terms with Jefferson Davis, all the way to the point when Jefferson Davis resigned as a senator from Mississippi to become, a supporter of Mississippi and eventually the Confederate president. So very interesting that Seward would do that, because he would be one of the more anti-Southern members of Lincoln's cabinet, which says quite a lot because they were all pretty anti-Southern. Simon Cameron, Secretary of War. So born in Maytown, Pennsylvania, he will serve as a senator for his home state from 1845 to 49 as a Democrat. He favored the annexation of Texas. He favored going to war with Mexico. However, was insistent that any new territory gained would not be slave states. Hence why he supported the Wilmot Proviso. Now, he does move over to the Republican Party when he is a U.S. Senator for his home state from 1857 until 1861. He steps down upon Lincoln's inauguration to take the role of Secretary of State. Now, this was a questionable appointment, partly because he had no military experience. And, well, we possibly got a war on our hands. We need someone with military experience. So that was a controversial appointment there. But he's going to get controversial in other ways as well in the near future. Edward Bates, actually from Goochland County, Virginia, just west of Richmond, Virginia. Now, but he will move to St. Louis at a relatively early age of 21, and he was a member of the Whig Party, so all the way until 1854 when he joins the Republican Party. And of course, remember the Republican Party was formed in 1854, and he was not in favor of the abolition of slavery. Now, that is interesting. A Republican who was against the abolition of slavery. He was against the spread of slavery. That's why he joined the Republican Party. He is also very anti-secession. And so that's also something that's very much up the sleeves of the Republican Party. He was nominated for the presidency, as was Seward, for the Republican nomination in 1860. Of course, he doesn't get it. Gideon Welles, from Glastonbury, Connecticut. Notice it's named after Glastonbury in Somerset in England, where of course the almost annual Glastonbury Festival takes place, music festival. And in spite of it, it's spelled differently with an E instead of an O. So Connecticut, New Englander. He did not go to West Point. However, he went to the military academy at Norwich, present-day Norwich University. He was a Democrat, like a lot of his fellow academy members, and now changes in 1848. Leaves and joins, becomes a supporter of the Free Soilers, and which of course becomes a part of the Republican Party in 1854. State level politics is going to be the beginning of his political career, and he will serve in that role for a while, 1827 to 1844. He does leave the Democratic Party because of the Mexican War. And so the Mexican War was very much supported by the Democratic Party and seen as a pro-slavery war. Well, Welles is very anti-slavery, and that's why he joined the Free Soilers after the Mexican War. So joining the Republican Party as soon as they came into existence, 1854, and he was a big supporter of Lincoln's nomination as the Republican candidate for the 1860 election. And he will serve as the Secretary of the Navy, and he was deemed a good fit for the role because of his time in Norwich. All right, so here we are, the two starting lineups for the United States and the Confederate States. Two cabinets, two very different cabinets, though also you could say very moderate by the standards of the day in a lot of ways. And these are the two rival groups that will be facing off through the war. There will be changes in lineup for both sides as the war progresses. Right, and with that, that brings an end to Lecture 8 of Dr. Tom's latest installment on the American Civil War lecture series. So again, if you like this video, then I hope that you will subscribe, that you will click on like, and I look forward to seeing you for Lecture 9, which will be coming up soon. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.